That I have Ephesians chapter 4, verse 26, which says this: "Be angry and do not sin. Do not let the sun go down on your wrath." And if you recall, the last time we met, which is feels like forever ago, but it was actually only 2 weeks ago, and I don't think that we've met in here for a while. It feels like it was a long time over there, because we had a number of Wednesday nights over there. But anyway, we've got a couple more weeks left of this, and we're dealing with respectable sins. Which, if you haven't been here, are the types of sins where they're common. They're very common. They become very acceptable to us because we see them all the time, and perhaps we know of other people that partake in these sins. They participate all the time, and it's just a very common thing as Christians. And so that's the kinds of things that we've been talking about. And a couple weeks ago, we talked about anger. And we talked about how to deal with anger and the different types of anger, your run-of-the-mill anger. We talked about righteous anger, and we talked about a number of different things a few weeks ago. And we talked about how to deal with it and what are we supposed to do. And we'll touch on that a little bit. He goes a little bit deeper. This is all based on the book, as you can see, Respectable Sins by Jerry Bridges. But he goes a little bit deeper into anger in another chapter called Weeds of Anger. And it's kind of a strange title, I think. And I've been through the book a few times, but I've always kind of thought it was a little bit strange, but it's interesting. But again, on the top of your handout there, we have Paul's admonition to us: be angry and do not sin, okay, which is, of course, something we talked about a few weeks ago. Most of the time, of course, that does mean that you can be angry without sinning, righteous anger. We talked about that. But the majority of the time, I think we mostly settled the fact that the majority of time, what we might call righteous anger, the anger has to be against sin, and it cannot result in a sinful response within ourselves. And so the majority of the time, we're not really upset about the sin, which is what righteous anger would be. The majority of the time, we're upset based on what is happening to us. And we kind of boiled everything that happens as far as our anger goes down to two things, really. Does anybody remember what those two things were? The root of our anger, you would say. Pride is one, and selfishness is the other, okay? So if you could just take care of that, we'd be fine. We wouldn't even be here, okay? We wouldn't have to be here on Wednesday nights for sure if everybody could take care of pride and selfishness, all right? And we really, I think, we saw that a lot of times, in fact, the majority of the time, what happens is we become angry because someone has said something about us, and yes, that thing that they said was sinful, perhaps. Most likely it was. It was gossip or whatever. They shouldn't have said that. That was wrong. But we're not angry really about the sin. We're mostly angry because our pride has been hurt. They said something about us, and we don't like that. And so our pride has been hurt. Or in a number of other situations where we get angry, where something has happened that's outside of our control, something has happened, we might say, to us, and because we did not get our way, then we get angry, and that's selfishness, because we didn't get what we want. So a lot of times, most of the time, that's what it boils down to. So we're going to talk about the weeds of anger tonight, and I'll explain in just a second what that is. But I wanted to start, and we've kind of you'll notice at the bottom of your handout, we don't have any discussion questions tonight. I've kind of mixed them in throughout, because a number of times we have not gotten to the discussion questions, and I do want to hear from you all. But the first question I have for you is this: why would Paul give us this instruction, Ephesians chapter 4, be angry and do not sin, do not let the sun go down on your wrath? And whether you think that Paul is actually saying, like, literally never go to bed angry, and a number of people take it that way, and that's fine. I don't have any problem with that. Some people would say, well, it's, there are times where it would be appropriate to say, you know what, we're going to wait and you're going to deal. Certainly in the context of marriage, perhaps, there's some strife, some animosity. There might be some greater wisdom in saying, you know what, we're not going to deal with this tonight because neither of us are in a frame of mind to be dealing with this. And I think there might be some wisdom in that. But in any case, whether you take that literally, what Paul is saying is without a doubt, don't let anger just exist. Deal with it. Take care of it. Don't allow it to reside in you. Why? Why is that an important instruction? Yeah. It festers. It becomes what? It becomes greater, so it grows. It doesn't just sit there, right? It doesn't just, unattended and no problem, it doesn't cause you any problems. No, for sure. Okay, good. Why else? Bitterness, good. Yes, Madeline. I turned 32 this past week, and my ears are going bad. I'm sorry. What was that? Okay, building up anger can lead you to want to sin. Very true. And we're going to talk about some of those sins tonight. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, Kedron. Yeah. We're not really good at hiding our feelings. Some people are better at it than others. I have found that I am very bad at it. If some of you have been around me long enough to know that if something's wrong, if I'm not having a very good day, I have no way of hiding it. I mean, it's just there, it's out there, and and some of you have been on like mission trips with me and stuff, and it can get bad. I mean, if I'm not having a good day or something, I do not hide it well. But the reality is that anger, if we can't cram it down in there. Okay, it's not just going to hide in there and just be okay. Right? We can't sweep it under the rug, as you might say. Nathan. It's not healthy. Yeah, there you go. For sure, it's not healthy. These things grow. Okay, and that's what we're going to talk about tonight. And that's why I wanted to kind of lay that as the framework for what we're talking about. How many of you have ever tried to pull weeds? Had to pull weeds around your house? Okay, I'm sure pretty much all of you have pulled weeds before. When I was growing up, we had we lived in this townhouse, so we actually only had any kind of property at all on the one side. The other side was our neighbor's side, and but it's not a townhouse. It's what am I trying to say? A duplex, yeah, twin house, and so we had this tiny little strip of land on the one side, and most of it was sidewalk, but there was this little tiny strip that ran right along the house of just dirt, basically. I mean, I guess from time to time we would plant stuff there and try to, make it grow things, but it never really worked very well. And most of the time, what did we have there? Weeds, okay? Weeds are not desirable. They're not a lot of fun to pull. I remember as a kid, that was like my least favorite job. It felt like it would literally take me all afternoon to pull that, tiny little stretch of land. And it probably did, because I was just, not doing it really. But in any case, it's not fun. Okay, and we're familiar with the concept of weeds. Weeds are undesirable. What might Bridges mean when he gives us this concept of weeds of anger? And I've already kind of hinted at this a little bit, but what might he be talking about, these weeds of anger? Okay, so the anger chokes stuff out. So like weeds, it chokes things out. Okay, good. What else? Yeah. Okay, so our anger might feel like it's deeply rooted and feel like we can't get rid of it. Okay, that's good. Okay, it reproduces other weeds. We're getting closer, I think. Yeah, Kedron.
If you don't get to the root of the issue,
Mm-hmm.
part of the issue, it's not really helpful.
Okay. Yeah, good. I think these are all good. And again, it's a little bit of an odd term, but what he really is describing here, the roots of, or the weeds of anger, these things, they pop up and they're undesirable because there's something going on below the surface that shouldn't be taking place. There's something growing down there, and like some of you have mentioned, if you don't get it up by the root, and it's not a perfect illustration, but what he's really talking about are the results. What are the results of harboring anger inside of us? What happens when we allow these things to dwell within us? What are the results of anger? What are the weeds? Again, is what he's saying. When we allow anger to take hold of our lives, we don't address it, and by recognizing it as sin, and this is what we talked about 2 weeks ago, recognizing it as sin. Uh-oh, did I just do something? There we go. It's coming back. Is it gone? What did I do? I'm trying this new fancy iPad here, see? Playing some tunes. Well, we may just have to proceed. The weeds got... Now, what happened here? I don't even think I pressed anything. Are you getting anything back there, Jeff? Just that? Huh. Well, might have to proceed without a... Okay. Well, sorry about that. But in any case, so what are the things that result if we allow anger to take root in our hearts and we don't deal with it, like we talked about a few weeks ago, we don't deal with it in a biblical way, confessing and forsaking it, changing our attitude towards that anger, the things that we talked about last time, these are the results. This is what's going to happen if we don't deal with our anger in the way that we talked about last time. Sin has consequences. Let's never forget that. And there's a lesson here in dealing with sin early and often, and keeping short accounts with God and keeping short accounts with those around us. Not allowing things to build up in our hearts towards God or towards other people. It's poison. And that's what we're talking about tonight. I apologize for the issues with the PowerPoint here, but hopefully you can follow along on your handout without a problem. But the first one that I want to talk about is resentment, okay? And we've already made reference to these kinds of things a little bit. And I want to make it clear from the outset here that these 5 or so weeds of anger that we're talking about, they're not mutually exclusive. There's some overlap in the terms, okay? But just to kind of help us think through what are the results, and if these things are present in my life, if I'm struggling with any of these things, these weeds that we're talking about, then maybe there is some anger that I haven't dealt with. Maybe there's something going on below the surface that needs to be addressed. But resentment is the first one, internalized, unresolved anger that is held on to. Where might we see this in everyday life? Just your run-of-the-mill resentment, okay? Where might that show up in our lives? Why might we be tempted to resent someone in our hearts? And again, this is kind of the next step from anger, okay? Anger, left unchecked, undealt with, you're going to start to resent that person, perhaps. And again, that's this unresolved anger that you're holding on to. You're holding on to something inside your heart. Where might we see that in everyday life? Coworkers. Yeah. So, I mean, certainly in our home life, and that comes up every week as we talk about these things. These things are very often things that need to be dealt with in the home, that show themselves very much in the home because they are around the people that we are closest to, and we feel like we can be ourselves around them, and so that sinful fleshly nature really comes out when we're at home, and that's very often the case. Also very good at work, okay? And I would think this might be the case with like a boss, perhaps, someone that that you may not necessarily have an audience with necessarily, someone that you're not, if you have some concerns about them, perhaps you have some problems, maybe even some ways that they've even offended you, and you don't feel like you're in the position that you can go to talk to them about those things. That could definitely result. You could start to resent that person in your heart. 2 Timothy 2 says this, "Flee also youthful lust, but pursue righteousness, faith, love, peace with those who call on the Lord out of a pure heart, but avoid foolish and ignorant disputes, knowing that they generate strife." Avoid these things. Avoid foolish and ignorant disputes. Don't get, it's almost like he's saying, don't get caught up in that. Don't get tangled up in that mess. Don't just deal with it, Just don't allow yourself to be bogged down by that, by resentment. So that's the first one, resentment, and that could be in the case of any relationships that we have. The second is this, bitterness, and Matt already mentioned bitterness, resentment that has grown into a feeling of ongoing animosity. So now we've leveled up, okay? We went from anger to resentment to now we're at bitterness. Now, what's bitterness? What does bitterness look like? You all tell me. What does bitterness look like? We've all met bitter people. We've all interacted with people that are bitter. What does that look like? Yeah.
It colors every relationship.
Yes.
Situation that happens to them, they always see the bad.
Yes, absolutely. They always see the bad. It colors everything that they see. Everything kind of passes through this negative filter a little bit, right? Yeah, good. What else? Kara.
It's very sad because their attempts at happiness
Yeah.
are always messed up.
Yeah.
The bitterness is there.
Yeah, it's like it kind of ruins everything. It kind of makes the individual not really all that pleasant to be around, right? And I'm sure many of you have met people like this where they've gone 10, 15, 20, even longer years, and now they're old, and it's like they're miserable all the time. And they have no joy, they have no real, and we think, and I think what happens is that when we're young, we think, that we can allow these things in, and that we can allow ourselves to be angry and then become resentful, and we can allow bitterness to set in, and we think that it's not going to affect us. We think that we can just kind of keep these things to ourselves. We can just kind of tuck that away in another corner of our life. And I still can't stand that person. And if I ever saw them, man, I tell you what, I wouldn't even be able to look them in the eye. Have you said that? Have you thought that about somebody? Friends, that's bitterness. That is allowing the root of bitterness to take hold. You're still holding things against them. It's resentment. That's grown into a feeling of ongoing animosity. People will sometimes say, I forgive him, but I'll never speak to that person again. Oh, I forgave him, but I'll never speak to him again. Or if I ever see them, you better believe they'll get an earful from me. Right? We say things like that. Oh, I forgave him, but this, and this. Now, let me ask you. Did they really forgive? No, come on. That's not forgiveness. Now, we've heard this recently, okay? Clearly, in that situation, forgiveness has not taken place. Forgiveness is putting it behind you, not bringing it up to yourself or anyone else. That's what forgiveness is. And I think Pastor Marshall mentioned that very recently. And even if it comes up in your mind unintentionally, maybe a situation, and you might say, I can't forget. Oh, okay. Well, nobody's saying you have to forget, but we do need to forgive. Even if the person hasn't asked forgiveness. Why? Why must you forgive? They haven't asked for me to forgive them. I'll forgive them when they come talk to me. Really? Exactly. Because if we don't forget, then bitterness and resentment is going to set in. And we know that those things are wrong. So we can't allow this. We cannot allow these things. We must, even if they don't come to us and ask forgiveness, we must still be willing to forgive as Christ has forgiven us. And we'll come to the parable of the unforgiving servant in a moment. James 3:14 says, "But if you have bitter envy and self-seeking in your hearts, do not boast and lie against the truth." If these things are dwelling inside of you, don't act like everything's okay. The next step is enmity or hostility. And again, these terms are not mutually exclusive, but this is kind of a level up, being actively opposed to another person, manifested through hateful speech, slander, etc. This is getting very serious now. This relationship has taken a very bad turn. And when it was still just little anger, I was still just a little bit upset with them, but I entertained that. Right? And then it became resentment and then bitterness, and now it's enmity, it's hostility. We're becoming actively opposed to this person. The next step is holding a grudge. And again, I don't know this exactly is in this order, but holding a grudge is part of this. Okay, that's the opposite of forgiveness. And that often, very, very often goes along with these other things, this resentment and bitterness. The same kind of idea. Holding a grudge means you're holding something against that person and you're unwilling to forgive them. Maybe you don't speak to the person, you refuse to even be in the same room. Romans 12 has something to say about this. If it is possible, as much as depends on you, live peaceably with all men. Beloved, do not avenge yourselves, but rather give place to wrath, for it is written, "Vengeance is mine, I will repay," says the Lord. Therefore, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him a drink. For in so doing, you will heap coals of fire on his head. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. As much as dwells within you, as much as it depends on you, as much as is possible for you, within your control. You can't control everything. That's okay. But as much as is within your control, live peaceably with all men. And that certainly doesn't involve holding a grudge. and then enmity and strife. I guess I got these out of order. I'm sorry about that. Enmity and hostility, and enmity and strife. Again, these terms are not mutually exclusive. These are weeds. They're results of unresolved anger in our lives. Ultimately, this could result in strife, actual like head-to-head, going at it. This is how this kind of stuff happens. Okay, you wonder, like, how does a church just split over the color of a carpet, which is, of course, the illustration we always use, but it happens. I've given illustrations from that pulpit of actual scenarios of churches that have fought over ridiculous things. It happens. And how does that happen? Well, it doesn't start there. It starts with anger, and it builds. So what do we notice about these things, these 5 things that we've laid out, these weeds? What is there some kind of pattern here? What do you notice about these things?
You don't weed one time.
What's that?
You don't pull weeds one time and walk away and you're good. You have to
It's an ongoing thing.
keep working at it, and that's the same thing with anger. We have to take this thought captive and take God's perspective on it. When we don't, these things pop up.
Absolutely. Yes, sir. An unforgiving heart. Very good. Yes. That's a common theme throughout all of these 5 things we mentioned is an unforgiving heart. They're all very much related. Something else, though. Something else. Yes, Lorraine.
Keep thinking of a weed whacker.
A weed whacker?
It makes things look good for a little while, but it doesn't get rid of the weeds.
Yeah.
You gotta get to the root.
Yeah. We can kind of deal with these things on a surface level.
Yeah, that's why
Maybe have amicable. What's that?
I don't like weed.
That's why that's why she doesn't like weed whackers. All right, good. There is a pattern here, I think, though. When you look at these 5 things as we've laid them out, what kind of pattern do you see? What's that? Leaves no room for Christ. Good. That's right. And we'll get to that. Lack of reconciliation, and I've kind of said this, and maybe that's why nobody's saying it. But there's a pattern of continual. What's the word I'm looking for? It keeps getting worse. It gets more intense. It starts as what we talked about 2 weeks ago, just like, just a little old anger. Okay, everybody gets angry. It's fine. Everybody gets angry from that now and again. Everybody loses their cool, blows their top, whatever. I mean, it happens, right? Okay, and so it starts with that, and maybe that anger is expressed, maybe it's internalized. But when it's internalized, these are the roots, or these are the I keep saying roots. These are the weeds that are going to start popping up. And the progression here is it gets worse. It doesn't get better. It starts with a little bit of resentment. Your run-of-the-mill resentment. I can't stand that guy, okay? We've all heard people say that, right? I can't stand him. I have a hard time being around him. When he talks, I just can't listen to him. I mean, he just annoys me. Some of you probably say that about me. Okay, you have this little bit of resentment in your heart, okay? And then you start growing bitter. And then it gets worse, and you hold a grudge in your heart against them, and then it turns into enmity and strife even. And you start, I mean, it doesn't get any better. It gets worse. These family splits, church splits, these things just don't happen. It's unresolved anger that leads to these things. Bridget says this, what I want us to see is that anger held on to is not only sin, it is spiritually dangerous. It's dangerous and for our own, almost think about this a little bit selfishly. Don't allow yourself to entertain these things for your own good. It's dangerous. And if you will scan back over these weeds, you will see that there is something of an escalation of feelings of ill will and dissension. Anger is never static. It never just sits there, as we've already mentioned. If it is not dealt with, it will grow into bitterness, hostility, and revenge-minded grudges. It doesn't just sit there. It's going to get worse. So how do we deal with the weeds? How do we deal with this anger? And again, he kind of elaborates on what we talked about last time. First of all, we need to recognize the sovereignty of God. Can anybody think of an example from Scripture of someone who recognized and was very well acquainted with the sovereignty of God? And that as a result, when he was wronged, could have gotten very angry. Yeah. Okay. And we just finished this last week, right? On Sunday, we just finished talking about the life of Joseph. And it all culminates in that wonderful verse in chapter 50, verse 20, where he says, what? You meant this for evil, guys. He says, am I in the place of God? Do you really think that I had control over this? Do you think that this was something that, like, I arranged this, that I put myself in this position? Now, no. He says, am I in the place of God? I'm not here to judge you. I'm not here to carry out vengeance. Vengeance is mine. I will repay, says the Lord. We just read that. Joseph says, look, am I in the place of God? No, I am certainly not. The brothers, they're like, Dad's dead. He's gonna take us all out on us now. Okay, now, he was only keeping us alive because Dad was still here. And Joseph says, look, guys, you meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. And there is a man who recognized the sovereignty of God in his life. And that's what we have to do too. When we are wronged, and we will be wronged, it will happen. You can mark it down. The people that we live around are just as much sinners as we are. And so if you're surrounded by sinners, you got to expect that bad things are going to happen to you. You're going to be wronged. When we are wronged, we must recognize that, just like Joseph, God meant it for good. There is a purpose behind this. There is a reason for this. As we've talked about several times in this study already, God is using the circumstances of your life to grow you into Christ-likeness. We saw that. We've mentioned it a number of times. Romans 8:28. That's what he's talking about. He's drawing us closer to himself. He's making us more like his Son. And that is very often the point of these things, of these trials that we go through, and even these interactions that cause us to anger, that cause us to be upset, that lead us towards these things, that give us opportunity, you might say, for resentment and bitterness to grow in our hearts. Even those things God is working through. He is using these things in our lives. So first of all, we must recognize the sovereignty of God. Second, we must pray that God will grow us in love. Pray specifically that God will allow the situations in your life that tempt you to be angry to help you grow in love. 1 Peter 4:8 says this, and above all things have fervent love for one another, for love will cover a multitude of sins. Pray that God will use this situation in your life to grow your love for those around you. And that's what we have to see these things, these inconveniences, these trials, big and small in our lives. We must see them as opportunities for us to grow. We must see them that way. It's not easy, right? That's not the first thing that comes to our mind. When we get a flat tire, or we get stuck in traffic, or whatever is causing us anger or frustration, like we've been talking about, these opportunities that we have, that's not the first thing that comes to mind. Oh, thank you, Lord, for this opportunity to grow. But friends, we can get to that point. And I dare say there are some of you in this room who have gotten to that point, that when bad things happen to you, you know what you say? You know what, Lord, this stinks, and I don't like this. But you know what? I know that there is something that you can teach me through this. It's an opportunity to grow in love. And the idea here that Peter's getting at is love will cover a multitude of sins. There's a lot of things that we get angry and upset about that we really don't need to. Now, there's a fine line here, because there is a difference between something that love can cover and something that we need to go and approach something. And let's not leave Matthew 18 out of the equation. If you have been offended, if someone has offended you and done something, and you're not able to let love cover it, if you want to call it that, as Peter does here, if you're not able to let love cover that and forgive and forget, then you need to go and talk to that person, right? That is your obligation. You need to go and speak to that person and say, hey, there's something between us. You've offended me. So often we sit here and we say, well, we kind of cross our arms and say, well, they can come talk to me when they're ready. They made me mad. They did something they shouldn't have done. And so when they're ready to come talk to me and they're ready to come and apologize, then they can. I saw something on social media just the other day. It said something like that. It said, like let's start off the new year right. Everybody come and apologize to me, or something like that. It's supposed to be funny, and it kind of is. We chuckle at that. But friends, we live that way. We live like everybody else owes us an apology. You know what the truth is? They may not even know they offended you. So there's a difference, okay? There's a lot of things that we get our we get upset about, that we ought to just allow love to cover it. But if you can't, and there are things that there's a lot of things that people do to us does not fall within that realm of things that we can let love cover. And in that case, you need to go and talk to that person, as Matthew 18 describes. So, but pray that God will grow us in love. Lastly, learn to forgive. We've talked about this a lot. I mentioned the unforgiving servant, Matthew 18. We don't have time to look at it tonight. When you consider the servant who was forgiven an uncalculable debt, basically like in our day, it's like 200,000 years worth of wages, which in our day is something like $6 billion. He was forgiven that much. And then some guy came along who owed him $10,000 or $15,000, like half a year's worth of work. Okay, it's not nothing. Okay, and that's a good point. You know, the people that have offended us, you know, we are the unforgiving servant, for the record. Okay, and we've been forgiven so much. And when we are unwilling to forgive those who have offended us, it doesn't necessarily mean that it was nothing. It wasn't nothing. They offended us. They did something that was wrong. $10,000 or $15,000 is not nothing. But compare it to the debt that we have been forgiven, the 200 million or whatever it is, basically the uncalculable debt that we have been forgiven. Friends, we should be willing to forgive. We should be willing to forgive because we've been forgiven so much ourselves. So recognize the sovereignty of God. Pray that God will use it and help you to grow in love through that situation. And then learn to forgive. And that's what we've come back to with all these roots, all of these weeds, this resentment, bitterness, hostility, holding a grudge, enmity. I mean, if we would just be willing to forgive and to recognize how much we've been forgiven, they would take care of all that. So I hope that's an encouragement to you tonight. I hope it's a challenge to you as well. I know that the temptation is great to allow these things. We kind of hold them, especially with family. You know, we can hold these things like I'm gonna keep that for a rainy day, right? Because the next time that they come along, you know, next time they mess up, or the next time I mess up, I can say, well, you know what, you did this such and such last time. You don't remember that? That's not healthy. Okay, that's sweeping it under the rug. And I think most of us in this room could give firsthand testimony to situations like that, where with family members and maybe extended family, where issues were never dealt with. Everything was just always swept under the rug. And where has that left those people? There's a reason that we have this book. And if we were willing to follow, we would save ourselves a lot of heartache, a lot of trouble. Let's pray. Lord, we pray that you would help us to be forgiving people. God, I pray that we would not allow these